Foreign Policy Association for inviting me to be here and to occasionally write for them as well, and the Banco Santander as well. It really is an honor to be here with you. With my degree in physics, I should try to explain the title of this, but I won't try that here. But Squaring the Latin American Circle, Leftist Governments and Conservative Economics. Let me just start out by saying that the big political news in Latin America, or one of the large political news that over the past several months, has been the sort of so-called move to the political left, particularly in South America, the emergence through elections of leftist governments in the region. And why was this considered so important? In other words, why is the emergence of leftist governments now in Latin America? Clearly, it's because it's mainly seen as something of a defeat for the United States. That the left opposes the U.S. agenda, free markets, the trade agenda. They make friends with Fidel Castro in Cuba. They oppose the global agenda of the United States. And, you know, the U.S. won the Cold War, and 15 years later, all of a sudden, it's losing the hemisphere to the left. Secondly, another reason that it's made news that this wasn't supposed to happen. In other words, that Latin American countries were all turning to free market economics. They were all becoming democratic. They were joining. There were shared values and interests with the United States. They were negotiating free trade arrangements with the United States. That really that Latin America wasn't supposed to sort of slip backwards as it was. Well, you know, sort of looking at it closely, my thought is it really hasn't happened. Or if it has happened, it's not really that important. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, that this, what was sort of the big news this year, really hasn't happened in the way it's expressed. The supposed swing to the left started really with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 1998. He took office in 1999, elected in 1998. At the time, I sort of did a quick review, and somebody may find that I'm wrong here, but I don't think there was any Latin American government at the time that was really identified as a leftist government in Latin America. But this was a sort of a strange start for a leftist resurgence, if you like, in Latin America, Chavez's election. Why? Because he started out in the military, as a military officer that tried to first win power back in 1992 with a coup d'etat, for which he was put in jail, and then he was let out, and he ran, and he won the election. When he won the election, it was mainly as a rejection of sort of economic and political failure of Venezuela more than anything. In other words, here was one of the countries with the richest oil reserves. That was really sort of per capita had enormous amounts of oil, and was also the country that did the worst of any country in the region, all of Latin America, for the 25 years before Chavez's election. In other words, if you look at its economic performance, there was only one country that did worse, excuse me. It was Nicaragua. And here was it should have been one of the richest countries. So Chavez's election was not decided on right-left. It was getting rid of the politicians, getting rid of the elites, getting rid of the political class, as they said. Now, we come to today, we have to be careful not to exaggerate of who's left and who's right. That three countries are clearly, no one identifies them in South America with the left. That's Peru, Paraguay, and Colombia. We could talk about each of those in questions and answers. I don't want to go into detail now. Another two sometimes people refer to them as left or potentially left. But again, I think it's very hard to identify them at all with the left, is Bolivia and Ecuador. These are countries with weak institutions, terribly unstable, sort of economically very messy, but left, it's very hard. Again, I'll be happy to go through why I'm saying that. And outside of South America, let me say there are left-wing movements in both of them, and left-wing movements that are quite potent, but there's nothing new in left-wing movements, certainly. And outside of South America, there's no left-wing governments anywhere else except for Fidel Castro. And so you have, when you add it all up, you have basically Venezuela and 4 other governments on which the whole trend is sort of based. And those 4 other governments, you have Ricardo Lagos in Chile, who was elected in 2000, Luis Ignacio da Silva, who was elected in Brazil in 2002 and took office in 2003, Argentina, President Kirchner, who took office in 2003 as well, and Tabaré Vázquez, who took, in Uruguay, who took office this year. Those are the 4 presidents which the basis for this left-wing trend is sort of based. And certainly each of them has a claim to leftist credentials. There's no question that Ricardo Lagos was a member of the Socialist Party, a supporter of Salvador Allende, named by Salvador Allende to be the ambassador to the Soviet Union back in 1973, and the coup d'etat came in Chile before he actually took up the position, but clearly a man of the left. Lula da Silva in Brazil, clearly with the organizing the Workers' Party, generally considered the most left-wing party in Brazil among the major parties, not there are certain sort of parties on the extreme, a small number of representation, but this is a major party, and it was considered one of the serious left parties in the hemisphere. You have Kirchner in Argentina, who was Montenegro, which was a supporter of the left-wing supporter of Peronism. To say he's a Peronist doesn't identify him at all politically, because the Peronists run all the way from the extreme right to the extreme left. He clearly emerged from the left side of the Peronist movement. And Tabaré Vázquez, one of the leaders of the Wide Front, again, a clear man of the left in Uruguay. Probably, if you meet him, he's the most traditional leftist. When you meet him, you feel like you're really meeting someone out of the 70s or even 60s. But somehow, now, the point is, left has to be more than belonging to a party in one's youth, like Kirchner. Or it has to be more than belonging to a party. It has to have some political implications. And when we talk about the left, or when we traditionally use the term left, there were 4 or 5 things that represented the left. That when you expected a left-wing government, one was there was often a sense of authoritarianism, that the parties were structured in an authoritarian manner, and that there was sort of often that they weren't particularly democratic. Second, they had a transformational quality about them. I mean, I was in Chile when Allende took power. The notion was to move Chile toward a socialist government. There was no question about that. It was the Chilean way to socialism, but it was the way to socialism. And certainly the left has always had this, we're going to change the capitalist order, we're going to change the political order. It has to have a transformation, not has to, but tradition. Third, there is a sense of economic populism in that we're going to reverse I guess this could be part of the transformational as well, but reverse the way income is distributed, the way wealth is distributed. We're going to turn the economy so that it benefits the poor and the vulnerable and the displaced rather than the wealthy. And fourth, in Latin America particularly, but I think worldwide, the left is generally with an anti-Americanism. In other words, that was part of the left. So now we can sort of take these, and there may be others, and if any other has a measurement of what makes a left-wing government, I'd be happy to try to incorporate that. First, authoritarianism, certainly none of the four have any evidence of authoritarianism. I mean, I think we could dismiss that Lula ran in 4 elections before being elected president. He organized a political party, never been known for violence. He has been sort of a regular participant in the politics of the democratic politics of Brazil. Similarly, Ricardo Lagos sort of was one of the people that engineered the transfer from the military to the democratic government. He serves as part of a broad coalition that combines the center and the left. He served in 2 of the governments that were run by centrist presidents. Then he won a primary to become the candidate of the coalition. Again, it's hard to identify an authoritarian instinct in that. Tabaré Vázquez, of course, is newer on the scene, but again, he sort of, for many years, he participated in primaries and never quite made it, and finally he's become president again after, but strictly according to the electoral route. Kirchner may be the only person that has at least the personal tendency, maybe there's an Argentine here that could confirm or deny that, but has certain personality that seems to be authoritarian. He doesn't call meetings of his ministers, cabinet meetings. He really takes decisions on his own and all. But that doesn't make an authoritarian political system. And the political system in Argentina, surprisingly, I think came very close to cracking, but in the end, the Constitution was preserved by and large. So I think we can eliminate Latin America's left. Now, if you take Chavez, he of course is a very authoritarian. I mean, there's no question that Chavez fits that mold very, very classically. In other words, he has basically eliminated any balance of power in the country. He's centralized power, and he continues to centralize power. He stacked the Supreme Court, developed a press law that he can use to attack the press, etc. So Chavez is very different from the other 4 on this political authoritarian. Transformational, again, it's very hard. I mean, Chavez talks about his Bolivarian revolution. Ricardo Lagos basically is sustaining the same government which he participated in as a minister under the previous 2 centrist presidents. No sense of transformational at all. Only sense of perhaps was to move Chile further from the Pinochet dictatorship, getting rid of the last restrictions on freedom and liberty that still are part of the Chilean system. But that was a process that was begun by his predecessors and will be continued by whoever follows him. I mean, he is, I think, he's turned out to be an extraordinarily good, competent president. But I think that over time, I mean, he's going to be seen as someone who has continued the tradition. So there was no transformation there. Lula was the big surprise that he was a man of the left, replacing the centrist government with a left rhetoric. And what everybody is surprised at is how smooth the transition was and how absolutely seamless the continuity has been on virtually almost, not only on the economic side, which I think that everybody recognizes, but even on the political side. The way Lula does politics in Brazil is very similar to the way his predecessor, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, did, which is not exactly the most, what might be call the most above-board politics. I mean, this is the politics of deals, the politics of clientelism, the politics of patronage and all. But that's the way the Brazilian system works, and there's certainly no transformation. Anyone that worked under Fernando Henrique Cardoso would recognize the politics of Brazil as being very similar today. Again, Tabaré Vázquez just took office, so it's hard to know. Economic populism, again, I think that we can go into details, and I'd be happy to on the economic politics. The closest to an economic populist is, well, besides Chavez, who again moves off the screen, but he has a lot of money to be a populist. I mean, that's one of the sort of luxuries that rich countries with lots of oil can afford, at least for some time, is to be populist. And the closest in rhetoric is Kirchner in Argentina. But again, if you look at the policies, he's actually managed a very conservative fiscal and monetary policy in Argentina, despite the rhetoric, the anti-capitalist rhetoric, the nationalist rhetoric. He's sort of been able to surprisingly keep inflation under control, at least up till now, and has really run a very, very, like I say, conservative fiscal process. But if there's any populist, it's somewhat Kirchner. But anti-Americanism, I think, is more clear, and that there is some degree of anti-Americanism. Although, again, if you get down into, I mean, Chavez, again, is off the charts on this, sort of personally insulting to the president, personally insulting to our Secretary of State, sort of travels to visit Saddam Hussein when he was still in power, traveling to Gaddafi, and making this clearly an very strong support for Fidel Castro. Well, then you look at the others. Yes, there's some anti-American rhetoric. Lula da Silva has talked about sort of combating the hegemony of the United States, joining with other third world countries. But then, he sent troops to Haiti, and in fact, he volunteered to manage the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti, which is clearly supporting U.S. policy in Haiti. He's been very helpful in basically moderating Chavez's support for the left in Bolivia. On trade issues, he's been very difficult on sort of hemispheric trade issues, but was very helpful. Not he personally, but the Brazilian government, the trade issues at the last serious negotiating round on the global trade last July in Geneva. So there's a mix there. I mean, it's clearly that there is, and the U.S. Has a good relationship with George Bush. The U.S. looks to him for help on issues like Colombia. He doesn't give as much help as the U.S. would like, and he certainly doesn't give the kind of vocal public support that the U.S. would like. But he has been helpful in a number of very difficult situations. Hard to call Lagos anti-American. I mean, he's the one that signs a free trade agreement with the United States. He opposed the U.S. in Iraq, but I think that lots of countries did that without being tagged anti-American, at least by anybody but the administration. So it's very hard to sort of push and sort of find what the left means, aside from having been part of a left-wing party and some degree of rhetoric. Now let me say that on the whole, I think that what we've seen is, first, the global setting has really changed. I mean, it's very hard to sort of manage, a modern economy, a modern global economy, something called a left-wing, closed, populist economy. You can name it the way you want. In other words, particularly for countries that are not very wealthy or not very rich, that are developing, the Chinese are probably the best example. The Indians are a good example that when you move away from sort of the closed economy, the more socialized economy, the state-run economy, you actually begin to be more successful, and that's a lesson that countries are learning. And countries realize they need investment capital, and most developing countries, and certainly Latin American countries, aren't saving enough to grow by themselves. And to get investment capital, you have to operate economics in a certain way. Also, I think that domestic politics have changed in most countries very dramatically. I mean, the inflation is just no longer tolerated. Latin America, there was a sort of a characteristic of Latin America before the 1990s. It was high inflation. It had the highest inflation in the world. At one point, more than 5 countries had it greater than 100%. It had the most cases of hyperinflation. Now, aside from Venezuela, it's hard to find any country with more than 10%, 12% a year inflation. And the big countries, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, all try to keep, and Mexico, keep inflation low. And they are very nervous about the politics of inflation. Also, most countries want stability, and the politics of stability have become very, not everywhere. And I think that the leaders of Latin America have changed to respond to these kinds of global and domestic demands. I mean, there's no real demand for Chavez except when sort of the political system was so corrupt and so ineffective and so inept. In many respects, Chavez was the left-wing Fujimori, if you like. Remember, Fujimori came to power. In 3 weeks, he came from nobody knew who he was. He had this great rhetoric, and he imposed a rather conservative, or rather, let's call it right-wing demagogic government. And so you have sort of, but this is a rejection of politics by people that have been exploited. Now, let me say that, and I don't want to take much more time, is there may be something to the left-right, and I may have left something out, I may have exaggerated, and people will argue it. But I would say that there's probably not a whole lot, and it certainly shouldn't be a major focus of anybody worried about Latin America. That's what I would think that's most important. I've been most disappointed with the press about, with the reporting on Latin America. Sometimes the administration has talked about left and right. I think that that's just far less important. What's really the major problem is sort of, I think, a dangerous political instability in just too many countries in the region. And it's really connected. And I say connected, I'm not caused by, because I think there's a cause and effect going back and forth that creates sort of, unfortunately, vicious circles in too many countries with, you know, political instability and sort of very fractious, combative politics, combined with very poor economic performance, weak institutions, persistent social and economic divisions. Now, right now in Latin America, a very high degree of lawlessness, criminality. And all those, I think, it's very hard to say where one begins and the other ends. But I think that it's this and generally you can sum it up with a high degree of poor performance and low stability over time. And I think that that's where the focus should be. I mean, the difference is not between Brazil and Colombia so much as it is between a Brazil and a Chile and on one side, and a Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador on another side. It's the difference between countries that have a reasonably functioning politics and economics and those that really don't. And that's the better way to think about it. And we can talk about what has to get done to move in that direction, and none of it is very easy. But I just think that the focus on left and right, which, like I say, if you see the headlines over time, has just been a mistake, and we continue to see it. I think there was it was an article about the left-wing emergence. It was the article about Mexico in the New York Times today talks about that there may be one more left-wing government now in Mexico to join this, and I think it just sort of distorts and covers up the real problems. Thank you.